Hey guys and gals, or gals and guys, because we're trying to move forward, not backwards, and equality for all. Anyway, thanks for joining us for another episode of Schooled. I am Nia Hamm. Well, no, I'm actually Nia Clark now. I changed my name legally when we got married last October in 2018. Best day of our lives. Except I'm still Nia Hamm on TV because it's confusing to viewers. TV reporter in my day job. Anyway, joined by the man who stole my heart and never gave it back. Also, my other half. Also, my moon. And I'm his stars.
I hope it's me.
Yeah, who else would it be?
I don't know.
Well, you're the only one here.
Well, good. I'm glad that's the reason why.
Who are you?
I am Jason Clark. I'm not on TV, but if I was on TV, my name would also be Jason Clark. And it's always been Jason Clark. Though I do know some folks, at least one person I know, who took his wife's surname. So if I did that, I guess I would be Jason Hamm Clark.
Yes, and I like him. I don't know him, but I think he's amazing and forward-thinking.
That's true. That's true. In fact, his name is actually also Jason, too.
What?
So, yeah.
And what's his last name?
I'm not going to tell you all that.
Okay, sorry. But still, I like him, whoever he is. And I suggest you consider doing that. We can always change it.
That is true. That is true.
But that's a conversation for another episode. Anyway, today we are going to be talking about something many of our still single friends tackle on a somewhat frequent basis. Because a lot of them are still single, which is fine, because some of them want to be single. Anyway, the issue is who foots the bill on the first date. Now, luckily, Jason and I don't have to deal with this because we are out of the dating game per se, although we still date each other as a married couple because it is important to keep your relationship fresh, spicy, let the other person know they are appreciated, and you just don't want to get comfortable. Although I do think we are far more boring in our older age than when we were younger and first met.
Funny, I thought you were going to go a different way. You're going to say that we didn't have to deal with it anymore because now that we're married, I pay the bill whenever we go on our date.
Well, yes, but that kind of has to do with the tone that we set early in our relationship, which is a really good point going into this discussion. Now, I'm happy to revisit the gender roles, and we can revisit some of the other responsibilities that I bear the brunt of, if you'd like to take those on.
No, I think this is a good delegation of responsibilities.
It works for us, okay? And I pay my fair share.
Yes,
I just do it in other ways that sometimes doesn't involve money.
Pay more than your fair share.
Yes, I do. I'm here, right? No. Kidding. Anyway, we are tackling this issue because it is something, especially that I feel my female friends deal with. The idea of gender roles has changed. Can we agree on that at least?
Yeah.
Okay. And with that, when it comes to dating etiquette, and particularly first date etiquette, the gender role shift has also shifted the thinking of a lot of people in our age demographic, millennials, Gen Zers, who are younger than us, and people are doing things a little differently. However, again, we still live in a patriarchal society, and the gender roles that our society has assigned to people and have, really built the society around, they still persist to a great degree. So we're seeing this tension between our friends and perhaps their newly defined idea of what gender roles should be or shouldn't be, or whether they should or should not exist, and then the traditional idea of what gender roles are and how they are divided among two people. Now, for all intents and purposes, most of my friends that I talk to are engaging in or pursuing heterosexual relationships. So I understand for our same-sex friends and listeners, it may be a little different.
That's a good point.
Yes. But I still say this conversation is still applicable because some of the things we're going to talk about are going to help us sort out some of the issues a lot of people deal with on first dates, regardless of what their gender is, which is important. So I think it's great to use expert takes when we talk about some of these things. While we are happy to opine on any and every topic, we have limited understanding, which is basically our own relationship. And we know what works for us and what has worked for us. However, we recognize that what works for Jason and I, or Jason and Nia, may not work for the next couple. And to be fair, neither of us are traditionalists in that sense. But as we mentioned earlier, we have sort of established a tone in our relationship from the beginning that we just stuck with. And we don't really feel a need to change it because it works for us. But maybe we will change it if we need to in the future, or if I get an amazing job and then I out-earn my husband tenfold. So yeah. Who knows?
Looking forward to that day.
Really? Interesting. Okay. They can hear you when you whisper. We're going to get this started by talking about the issue of who pays on the first date, who should foot the bill on the first date. And this is great because there's an article in the Washington Post by finance columnist Michelle Singletary where she tackles this issue. And this came out last year, but within the past year. Anyway, it's called #Who Pays? Who should foot the bill on the first date, right? So Michelle Singletary talks about her 23-year-old daughter's experience on a first date and how, well, from a perspective of a woman who's been married almost 30 years and hasn't dated for at least that amount of time, it might be challenging to understand. But she gives some really great advice for somebody who is several generations removed from her daughter's, experiences. So I'm just going to start off by reading a little bit of the beginning of this article, and that will give our listeners some perspective here. So she says, it's hard to know the rules about who pays on a first date anymore, which can make for some very awkward moments. My 23-year-old daughter recently came back from a first date with some questions about what happened when the time came to pay for the evening's food and fun. She had agreed to meet the young man at a high-tech driving range, restaurant, and entertainment complex. Their first stop was the miniature golf course. The cashier asked whether he should ring them up separately. There was a pause. My daughter said she was thinking that he should pay because he asked her out. After a few seconds of silence, the young man broke the awkwardness and volunteered to cover the charge for the two of them. After a mini golf, they decided to get something to eat. When the bill arrived after the meal, there again was an uncomfortable pause. Quote, he looked at the check and signed a few times, my daughter said. Quote, so I offered to pay. The guy quickly and happily accepted. He was grateful even. Still, she was disappointed he took her up on her offer. Quote, I wanted him to want to pay, she said. Or at least not make me feel bad for wanting him to pay. To clarify, my daughter said she's sympathetic about the cost of dating. For her, it's not about a man spending a lot of money on her. She just wants to be courted. Her word, not mine. Yet, this modern-day millennial is conflicted. Old school tradition dictated that the guy paid as part of a chivalrous romantic courtship. New school thinking is that such chivalry can be condescending. Still, my daughter said she and her single girlfriends want to be wooed at least for the first few dates. And guys show their interest in treating them special in part by paying for the date. Over the past few years, Match, the online dating site, has surveyed about 5,000 singles to get their take on various dating habits. In its latest Singles in America survey, Match found that 91% of women think the man should insist on paying on the first date. So this is a great experience because I think it completely encapsulates what a lot of women and men go through. I'm sympathetic, honestly, to guys these days. I think dating in general is really hard. But when you live in a metropolitan area where there are so many more options available to a person than perhaps in more rural, less populated areas, I think it's even harder. In part because I think people feel like they always have a better option and perhaps sometimes don't appreciate what's in front of them. Even that's another podcast episode. Still, I think it's not only hard for women who, like Michelle Singletary's daughter, want to be courted, but also for men who, if you're a millennial or a Gen Zer, the odds are that you have some sort of student loan debt that you are trying to pay off, or perhaps you are starting out in your career and you're trying to gain some traction there. And unless you're making oogads of money, you're going to need to budget well and smart in order to be able to support yourself. Now, a lot of people are still living with their parents these days, and perhaps that frees up the cash flow for some people. But for those of us who are living on our own and in charge of keeping a roof over our own heads, that's a good chunk of our income. So I get where the guy is coming from. What do you think, Jason? Do you think he handled it well when the second bill came and the girl, after several moments of silence, offered to pay, and he jumped at the chance for her to do that?
And in that situation, do we know how old the two of them were? About?
The girl is 23, so we can assume that the guy is around that age.
Okay, all right. I mean, I think that he could certainly have done a better job with it. It's difficult because, especially without knowing someone's full background. I mean, let's say this is somebody who is dealing with a lot of like financial issues and only was able to, was really budgeting maybe for just that first bill, and didn't realize that there was going to be more, or in his head thought that it was going to cost X amount, and his date ends up purchasing something that is more than what he was originally budgeting for.
We don't know what they ordered.
Yeah, so I mean, there are a lot of variables in there that you want to keep in mind. But I mean, I generally do agree that I think the best thing in the beginning is to try to, whatever it is, just, suck it up. I mean, I think, it's true though, because you want to be able to, you don't want whoever it is that you're interested in and that you're dating to feel like they're not worth it. And I think at the end of the day, that's really what it comes down to. In some cases, it ends up being, paying for a check. But in one way or another, you want to make that other person feel like, you're worth it to them. And that's just one of the ways that it's done. I mean, I think what you want to do is be thoughtful about it, right? And it's, and I'm trying to give the guy some slack, because if he's 23, I mean, he's still pretty young. But you want to make sure that maybe the place that you recommend to go to is a place that's, within your financial means. And just recognize that even if you end up paying for that first date, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have to pay for all the dates in the future. But you do want to get to the next day. So whatever you can do, I think, in the beginning to make the other person feel like they had a good experience, because they don't know you that well at all, because this is the first time you're actually seeing them. I feel like that's kind of the way you want to deal with it.
I think that's a fair assessment. Now, Michelle Singletary and her husband, actually, I guess they talked about this, and she says, "My daughter asked my husband and me what we thought was appropriate. Admittedly, after nearly 27 years of marriage, we have been out of the dating game for quite some time. Nonetheless, here's our advice to her on the first date funding dilemma." So she says, number one, if you're asked out, your date should pay. And she says, most etiquette experts suggest this is a good rule of thumb for a first date. When you ask someone out, you're inviting the person to be your guest, and guests shouldn't expect to pay, which is true. I mean, it's like inviting somebody to your home, right, for dinner and being like, but you gotta bring the meal kind of thing. So I'll supply the roof and you supply the meal. When the person is thinking, well, why would I do that? You're inviting me to your home. You should be supplying the meal. So also she goes on to say, admittedly, this rule gets complicated under the current dating norms where women are just as likely to be the ones doing the asking. So you might want to share your views on being courted with potential suitors to establish your expectation that you want to be the one who is asked out, not the other way around. And again, it sounds like she's framing this in a more heterosexual context. But still, if you're a same-sex couple or you're a homosexual person, if you're gay, right, like, and you're asking somebody out, the same rules apply, right? If you're dating somebody of the same sex or you're interested in people of the same sex, I think the same rules apply, whether you're heterosexual or not. If you're asking somebody out, you should be the one to pay, at least when it comes to the first date. I mean, I can't imagine a scenario in which somebody would ask another person out and then expect them to pay. And I think this poor guy probably got I think maybe he didn't budget well. I think maybe he wasn't realistic about the costs of what this date would cost. This sounds like an expensive first date, miniature golf course and dinner. That doesn't sound like, I mean, it's definitely at least $100. And for somebody who's 23, that's not an insignificant amount of money. You have to imagine they probably recently graduated from school, or perhaps they're in graduate school, right? So
maybe. But I mean, the way I look at it is it's about who's courting who, right? If you're the person who's courting the other person, then maybe you should do what you can to make sure the other person, like, take more of an ownership. I mean, obviously it's about the two people themselves getting to know one another, but usually there's one person who's at least in charge of the actual date for that day, right? I mean, it's the same way, let's say you were going on a second date, right? And this maybe kind of goes to your point before, where let's say the person you're dating offers you to come by their apartment for a meal, right? It may not be money, for example, but like you're saying before, you're expecting that they'll be putting together something to make sure it's a good experience, like the food or whatever. You may bring the wine or something like that, but it's still about one person taking ownership of that day.
Yeah, and so that's true, right? I still think there's something to be said for being forward thinking and having a budget. If you're going to take a person out, and you should know where you're taking them, right? On a first date, you shouldn't just be like, all right, what do you want to do? I'd be looking at you like you were crazy, I'm like, you didn't have this planned out. You asked me out. You're supposed to know what we're going to do. And so when you do that, you should have an idea of how much, like, for example, when we went out on our first date over 5 years ago, you had a very good idea of where we were going to go. And I'm sure you had a very good idea of what it might cost. Now, again, I was late. So by the time I had gotten there, you were actually a little tipsy, probably drunk, because you'd been waiting so long. So you probably went a little over budget. But still, I think you still had a decent idea of what it was going to cost.
Yeah, I mean, and that's definitely true. But to be fair, I mean, by that point, it's been like a few years. I mean, I was older, much older than this person was. So there's a lot that you learn about dating by that time. And I think part of it, and we maybe mentioned it before, but it's really just about figuring out what it is you can make the other person feel special. So yes, you could take someone out on some really expensive date, but recognize that's probably going to cost a lot of money. But at least in my experience, to talk to my friends, I mean, as long as you can do something that makes a person feel special, and that may just be thinking or knowing a little bit more about the person or what someone like that may be into. Like, let's say they were into, comic books. If you took them to Comic-Con, maybe something like that. or if they're really into, flowers or nature, taking them to the botanical garden. Like, there are ways that you can make someone feel special without just shelling out a lot of money. And I think that goes to the point you're saying before. It's really just about having a plan and thinking about it.
And that's actually the next point in the article. If you're asking, pick a date you can afford. Don't choose a place that you know is outside of your budget. So the other point she makes is avoid a split the check showdown, right? So that is what would get me, is if you asked me out and now the bill comes. We're having a great time. We're laughing. Maybe we're drinking. Maybe we're tipsy. The bill comes and you're staring at each other as if you're in the wild, wild west and trying to figure out who's going to pull the gun first. And the mood just gets killed. You totally kill the mood that way. And I have friends who've been through this so many times, including recently, and they tell me it makes them not want to go out with the person again. The next time the person asks them out, they're like, do I really want to go through that? Because you're going to be looking. And so when you have a situation where now you're going on multiple dates with somebody, that's a different story in terms of who pays. Now, for me personally, I'm not a traditionalist, but I do feel like if somebody is courting me, then they should court me. And that means that if you're asking me out on a date and we're still new, we're not officially like dating exclusively, I happen to think that person should foot the bill. That's just me. There are times in our relationship when we had been dating for a longer period of time, and then what I didn't want, which has been done to me in the past, was a man to use his money to try to control me. Right. That has been done to me before, and I said, never again will I let a man think that his income dictates the rules in our relationship, because that is not how it should be. So because of that, that is one of the reasons that sometimes I like to pay or I like to contribute to a date, because I don't want you to feel, Jason, like, the world is on your shoulders. And then B, I want you to know that I care, and I want you to know that I appreciate you, and that I'm not just here for a good time, but also even more so, or maybe as equally so, that you don't think that, okay, I'm paying, that way I can tell her what goes and what doesn't. Even though you're not that kind of person, and you would never do that. I know. You're not that kind of person.
I don't think that would ever work either.
Well,
but that's definitely true, and that's a good point. I mean, like, yes, you want to be able to make sure that you're taking control or taking ownership of making sure you're having a good time, but you shouldn't believe that just because you're doing that gives you some type of ownership over the other person. And that can sour a date just as well, because now that you've paid for something, you think that there's certain expectations, or that you're the one who's making all the decisions. I mean, it's still a partnership. It's still trying to figure out if the two of you work together. So just want to be mindful and just recognize, look, if you're going to go out and have a good time, someone's going to have to pay for it. And if you're the one who's doing the courting, then it may be you, especially in the beginning. But, that's part of dating, and that's part of getting to know folks.
Having said that, there is another survey that was written about in bankrate.com. And it is about younger Americans and how they view talking about money on a first date. And interestingly enough, it says that for young adults, talking about money on the first date isn't as awkward as it used to be. Millennials are nearly twice as likely as their elders to say they're comfortable sharing credit scores and swapping stories about debt with a potential love interest, according to Bankrate's Love and Money survey. And so it's really interesting, actually. So then it has a quote from Mara Liz Meinhofer, who is a friend to our podcast and has been on our podcast in the past. And she says, quote, they really are more open to having the money conversation with their partners early on, which is definitely a generational shift, says Mara Liz Meinhofer, a certified money coach and founder of Love and Money Therapy. quote, "It's something that didn't used to happen, and it's very healthy, and it's starting to happen among them." So the reason I bring that up is because, even though there are probably good rules of etiquette to follow on a first date, the fact that younger adults are feeling more comfortable talking about finances on the first date can really break the ice and remove some of that awkwardness and tension. And it really might even encourage both people to be mindful of how much they order or what they order or where they even go. And especially for the next date, right? It takes some of that pressure off of the expectations.
Yeah.
So
just making sure people are on the same page.
Yeah, absolutely. So I find that really encouraging. I don't think we talked about our finances for a while.
Oh, yeah. I don't remember.
Yeah.
That was definitely a while.
It was 5 years ago. It was over 5 years ago, which doesn't seem like a long amount of time, but it can be because dating in general is changing so much, so rapidly. Like, it's amazing how much it's changed since we got together. And so I just know that, like, if you'd asked me how much student loans I had on our first date, you'd probably be like, well, that's a wrap. No. See you later. Because then you're thinking, okay, if I marry this girl, then that becomes my debt. So I'm glad we waited to have that conversation.
Yeah, I didn't even think about that.
But that's great for those who do want to get to know each other a little bit faster these days. Mm-hmm. So yes, I personally think that's an amazing generational shift. I think you should be mindful. And you know what? To another point Michelle Singletary made, there is nothing wrong with somebody being cost conscious on a date, especially on a first date. That to me shows that person is responsible and they understand how to manage their money. So, for example, she brings up this idea of Groupon, like using a Groupon on a first date. For a 23-year-old, I'm like, okay with that. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I probably wouldn't announce it at the table while the waiter is standing there in front of me on my date. She mentions you might want to pull the waiter to the side or let them know before you sit down. But I think being cost conscious on a first date is smart. There is nothing wrong with that. It is not a sign of cheapness. What I think some of my friends struggle with, at least, is that the man is so cost conscious, he comes across as being cheap. And what I say to that is, it isn't for me about how much money you make or how much money you spend on me. It is your generosity. Because somebody who is willing to perhaps treat you to a good time, especially on the first date, that to me says that person is giving. And giving and being generous, to me, is a sign of good character. And that is somebody you want to be around. But if somebody is restricting you to like a 1-drink minimum or making you order off of the dollar menu or whatever, then that to me says this person not only is cheap, but more importantly, they are not a very generous or giving person. And that is not somebody I would want to entertain or invest my time in.
Yeah, exactly. Makes a lot of sense. But on the other side, you just want to be mindful that sometimes you go out on a date and it's not just about that, but they're expecting, or some people may just want to go to places that are really expensive, right? Like sometimes you may be like, well, and there's like a fine line. It doesn't mean that every date has to be like a walk in the park, but every date doesn't also have to be going to the like most expensive club and spending a ton of money. And I think part of that comes from, at least from my perspective or my friend's perspective, you want to make sure you're going out and have a good time. But you can also recognize too if the other person only seems interested in things that are more superficial or cost a lot of money, or things that are just going to be able to show that they're, how fabulous they are maybe online. When that happens, then it can easily turn off the guy as well.
Agreed. So having said that, y'all, here are some ideas for dating on a budget, courtesy of this online website called The City for Millennials. Just to give you some ideas if you are trying to date on a budget and you want to impress your date, but you don't want to go into debt doing it. There are some really great ideas in this article. It's actually called 10 Best Ideas for Dating on a Budget, again, in the city for millennials. So one of them, and I think this is something that you can think about when is the right time to do it, but being one with nature, going on a walk or doing something outdoors, a little adventurous and fun, costs less money, gets your endorphins going, maybe burn some calories in the meantime, probably more peaceful and perhaps more stimulating than sitting inside of a bar anyway. Taking a walk, even if it's not in nature, going on a picnic, which I love the idea of personally, movie night, Netflix and chill. Now, disclaimer, I think Netflix and chill should only be done past date 3 or 4. I don't think you should be Netflixing and chilling on date 1. That's just me. Of course, there are museums, great way to impress a woman, or if you're nerdy like me, I think that's a great idea. Also, watching the sunset. How amazing and romantic. People are so connected to their electronic devices, cell phones, tablets these days, always on social media. Oftentimes, people are out together and still on their phones a lot of times. So I think somebody who takes the time to be thoughtful enough to say, why don't we just connect, right, with our circadian rhythm and watch the sunset. I think that's a freaking awesome idea. So a couple of things to think about, photo shoot, another great idea. Taking a drive, if you do drive, taking a scenic route, maybe taking somebody to one of your favorite childhood places, all really cool stuff you can do on a budget. So anyway, that's some advice from...
Yes, I know our next 10 dates. We'll go out, see a sunset, and talk about our circadian rhythm.
I just gave you 10 great ideas to impress me. You're welcome, by the way. Anyway, we hope this helps a lot of not only our friends, but a lot of our listeners who struggle with these issues. Times are changing, and sometimes you do have to change with the time. But there is something to be said for etiquette, I think.
Yep, I agree.
Okay, other half. We are happy and so grateful you joined us for this episode of Schooled. If you want to continue listening to our wonderful advice, not only from ourselves, but all of the many experts that we bring on every week, you can do so. And you can find us on social media. And we are at Schooled Podcast on Twitter and Instagram. And if you just search Schooled, that's SKOOLED on Facebook, you will find us as well.
Yep. And thanks again for the date ideas. I feel like I just got schooled.
You absolutely did. Bye.